Tonight, climate change taking center stage at the UN, where President Obama addressed the assembly and said it is now past time for the world to take action. Tonight, an expert on the global crisis tells us why the time for change is past due. And the U.S. begins its air assault on ISIS militant targets in Syria with the world's cooperation. They also targeted Khorasan, a group, an al-Qaeda cell plotting to attack American and Western interests. The question is, will airstrikes get the job done? Tonight, military analyst Mike Lyons back on the show to weigh in. Plus, a Connecticut woman who was mowed down by a cyclist in Central Park has sadly died. Is it high time for the police to start cracking down on these bicyclists? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French and thank you so much for joining us. This evening we begin with a look at a crisis that is not only affecting people in some other country, it's impacting us right here at home, and I'm talking about climate change. And this week, people in New York, Rio de Janeiro, and other parts across the globe are all calling for action. Now, world leaders have converged on New York City at the UN, where they're holding a climate change summit promising billions of dollars to take better care of the earth. Pledges all coming in response to a challenge from the UN Secretary General. By mid-morning, leaders, they pledged at least $5 billion to help the globe become more sustainable. Now, the Secretary General, Mr. Moon, says that this needs to set a new path to reverse the rise of global warming. And today, the President, Mr. Obama, also spoke before that same assembly. He said that no nation gets a free pass when it comes to climate change.
Yes, this is hard, but there should be no question that the United States of America is stepping up to the plate. We recognize our role in creating this problem. We embrace our responsibility to combat it. We will do our part, and we will help developing nations do theirs.
The president did say that it is necessary for every single nation to cut carbon pollution to prevent the worst effects of climate change. He says the U.S. will meet its goal to cut carbon pollution by 17% come 2020. That's comparing it to 2005 levels. Well, today I spoke with Professor Daniel Esty, who is the director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. He's been very involved in this subject. In fact, he was involved in this back in '92 when this really got started on the international level. And he said changes, unlike what they tried to do more than 20 years ago, this time maybe it needs to start at the local level. You know, I'm curious your perspective on this, because you see some of the energy there on the street in New York and the global attention, the president obviously speaking to this issue. 22 years ago, you were at the EPA, you were one of the people who helped craft this negotiated agreement so that we'd get ahead of this, but yet 22 years later, we're right where we started and arguably even in a worse position. Is there a little bit of deja vu, even for yourself, when you see these conversations all on the ramp up to next year in Paris with very little, hope, I think, for many people that some sort of change will actually take place?
Well, I think the reality is that we've got to move in some new directions. When we put this original framework convention together 22 years ago, I think people had a picture in mind of how you made progress on the environment that involved federal governments, nation states, setting commitments, targets and timetables that would be implemented through a series of top-down measures. And I think what we've learned, and we saw it on the streets of New York on Sunday, is that the real energy on climate change is actually coming from the bottom up. And that's why I've been arguing that we need a different approach heading for Paris at the end of next year. We really need to try to capture the energy on climate change that's being expressed at the community level and through mayors at the city level and through states and governors that are taking real action. So I think that's the hope heading for Paris, is that we can energize the process with a new dynamic that's bottom up.
And I want to get to that, and many people may have seen your piece in the Times on the very subject, but it seems that at least the dynamic where we are right now is unlike not that many years ago, the whole climate change deniers, nobody's really listened to them. We at least acknowledge reality. People can debate as to how fast that timeline is moving here, but nonetheless, we accept there's a problem. But do you understand the cynicism or the defeatism of the public who says, you know what, I hear it, but the Chinas of the world, they're not going to play ball, or there's very little we can do, or you can't do this in a piecemeal approach. Is that the biggest hurdle, to get people to believe you can do something, or to get the nation states to believe they have to do something?
Well, I think there's a couple of different problems that are all happening at once. One is this is a problem that unfolds over a long period of time. So people don't see it, they don't feel it, or they don't think they see it and feel it, and therefore there's a tendency in human nature to put off that which we can put off till a later date. So I think that's part of it here, is that it does seem distant to us, distant in time, and perhaps distant in space. The real impacts may be in some other places, not on us. Although we in the New York area really should know that there is a potential serious burden to us, having seen some terrible storms over the last several years, the kind of thing that we may see more of when climate change begins to increase the intensity and frequency of hurricanes and other windstorms. So I think there is some reality that's beginning to set in. And I do think there is some sense as well that we can't solve the problem on our own. It takes global action, and that's clearly true. But it would be a mistake to think that China is not acting. China is stepping up. Their most recent 5-year economic plan, which is the central structure of the Chinese economy, calls for substantial action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to improve energy efficiency, to shift towards cleaner fuels. So I think China is ready to play ball, and we need to step up as well.
You penned a recent piece called Bottom-Up Climate Fix, where you say you yourself here have had a change of heart about how to enact really or mobilize some of the change. But tell everybody how getting governors, mayors, community leaders, even business leaders to sign on, to get really behind this, really changes this, when it seems that if you have the outliers that aren't playing ball here, you need everybody to be pulling in the same direction, seemingly.
Well, I think what you've got is a situation in Washington where there's a great deal of difficulty getting things through the Congress, and it seems like the U.S. federal government is not in a position to really provide an energetic posture on climate change. And I think there's a sense in the international negotiations, which again are nation state to nation state, that a lot of governments are kind of burdened by this and are not ambitious, not energetic. And when I look out across the world, I see lots going on in terms of addressing climate change. And I think we've seen it in New York City with some of the things Mayor Bloomberg did, a very ambitious sustainability plan for the city. But mayors all over the world are doing similar things. I was in New York earlier this week with the mayor of Copenhagen, who's broadly increasing public transportation, reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions through a variety of measures, including a district heating system that is much more efficient than traditional furnaces in every home.
You know, finally, Professor, I'm going to ask this to our panel in the next segment, but hypothetically, if I gave you the marketing fund to try to communicate and mobilize the public for this, but you have to choose a track. Is it to scare the bejesus out of the public about the consequences coming down in the not-too-distant future if inaction continues to take root? Or is it to preach that there's still time and that there's an optimistic approach that we can still do a lot here and that we can turn this thing around? Is it better to scare or to inspire?
I think optimism beats fear almost every time. And in this case, I think there is a worry that some of the scaring the bejesus out of people approach has in fact resulted in paralysis. People think, oh my goodness, this is too difficult, I can't do anything. So I'm much more focused on demonstrating that there are paths forward, in fact, cost-effective paths forward, and that taking action need not be very expensive, can in fact bring on a new clean energy economy with lots of entrepreneurial activity possible and lots of new jobs and breakthroughs that could bring a real economic growth to our society, particularly if the United States takes the lead on it. And I think it also is the case that we have to understand that it's not a choice of taking action at big expense or having no cost and not taking action. In fact, inaction has a huge price. And I think it's that combined story that there really is an opportunity here and a big opportunity to do things in time and in an effective way that is more likely to motivate people to really step up to this issue.
Daniel Esty, I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
All right, we're all invested in this subject, and I want you at home to chime in. Go to Facebook and Twitter and sound off on our question tonight. When it comes to climate change, do you think we will see significant progress in the next 10 years? We'll be right where we're standing now. Coming up, we're going to bring our panel in to join this discussion on climate change. We're also going to be talking about what ought to be done to get more Americans and people around the globe invested, put pressure on their lawmakers to do it. And there's different approaches. Just like I asked our guest, do you scare the public or do you try and inspire them? We'll be back with more on that after this.